We remember World War II as the last good war, the clear war, the one where we knew who the villains were and what we were fighting for. We built monuments, we made films, we taught children that this was the moment when the world chose right over wrong. But beneath the medals and the carefully edited history, there was another war, one where decisions that would later be called atrocities were filed under routine operations, where men in pressed uniforms signed documents that sent thousands to their deaths before lunch, where the law said yes to things that made the Geneva Conventions look like suggestions written in disappearing ink. This isn't about secret Nazi experiments or hidden Japanese war crimes. This is about what everyone knew, what was legal, what was approved, what was considered perfectly acceptable during 6 years when the rules of civilization were suspended and replaced with something else entirely, something we agreed to and then tried to forget. When France fell in 1940, the British government faced a problem. The French fleet was the fourth largest in the world. Modern battleships, destroyers, cruisers, enough firepower to shift the balance of the entire naval war. And now France had signed an armistice with Germany. The term said the fleet would be disarmed, that it wouldn't fall into German hands. Churchill didn't believe it. He couldn't afford to believe it. So on July 3rd, 1940, the Royal Navy sailed to Mers el-Kebir in French Algeria, where a large portion of the French fleet sat at anchor. They delivered an ultimatum: join Britain, sail to a neutral port, scuttle your ships, or we open fire. The French admiral refused. He didn't believe the British would actually do it. They had been allies weeks ago. At 16:54 hours, HMS Hood opened fire. 15-inch shells crossed the harbor in seconds. The battleship Britannia exploded and capsized in minutes. Provence ran aground burning. Dunkirk was crippled. 1,297 French sailors died. They died fighting no one. The British weren't at war with France. This wasn't combat. It was an administrative decision. Churchill addressed Parliament days later. There was no remorse in his voice. He explained the necessity, the strategic calculation, the mathematics of preventing a hypothetical German advantage. The House cheered. France protested but took no action. Under international law, Britain had attacked a neutral power. But neutral meant nothing anymore. The law said you couldn't attack non-combatants. The law also said you could take any action necessary to prevent a threat to national security. When those two rules conflicted, the one that involved killing won. Every time. No one was prosecuted. No one was charged. The operation was classified as a legitimate act of war, and the war had just learned it could eat its own. In 1941, before America entered the war, Franklin Roosevelt faced a constitutional problem. The American public didn't want another European war. The Neutrality Acts were explicit. No American ships in combat zones, no weapons to belligerents, no loans to countries at war. But Britain was losing. U-boats were sinking convoys faster than they could be replaced. Roosevelt needed to arm Britain without technically violating neutrality. So his administration invented Lend-Lease. The concept was simple. America wouldn't sell weapons. It would lend them. Britain wouldn't pay in cash. It would pay after the war in goods and services to be determined later. Legally, this meant the United States wasn't a belligerent. It was a landlord, renting destroyers the way you'd rent a house. The Neutrality Acts said nothing about lending. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March. $50 billion in weapons, tanks, aircraft, ships, food, all classified as loans. American factories built the machines that fought the Nazis, while American law said the country was neutral. Roosevelt ordered the Navy to patrol the Atlantic and report U-boat positions to the British. Still neutral. He authorized American ships to escort convoys halfway across the ocean. Still neutral. In September 1941, a German submarine fired on the USS Greer after the Greer had been tracking it for hours and radioing its position to British aircraft. Roosevelt called it an unprovoked attack. He issued shoot-on-sight orders for any Axis submarines in the Western Atlantic. America was fighting an undeclared naval war 3 months before Pearl Harbor. and it was completely legal. Because neutral didn't mean what the dictionary said it meant. It meant whatever allowed the most violence within the technical boundaries of law. The Germans knew. They didn't declare war. Neither did America. Both sides just killed each other in a zone where legal definitions had stopped functioning. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, it almost came as a relief. At least now the paperwork matched reality. Convoy PQ-17 sailed from Iceland to Arkhangelsk in late June 1942. 35 merchant ships carrying war supplies to the Soviet Union, an Allied mission, escorted by destroyers and armed trawlers. British intelligence reported that the German battleship Tirpitz had left port and was heading toward the convoy. The Tirpitz was the most powerful warship in European waters. If it reached the convoy, it would be a slaughter. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, made a decision. He ordered the convoy to scatter. The merchant ships were told to break formation and proceed independently. The naval escorts were ordered to withdraw. 35 cargo ships were left alone in the Barents Sea with no protection. German U-boats and aircraft found them within hours. They sank 24 ships. 153 merchant sailors died. 430 tons of supplies went to the bottom. Tanks, aircraft, vehicles. The Tirpitz never came. It had turned back before it got close. The order to scatter had been based on faulty intelligence and excessive caution. The Admiralty reviewed the decision. Pound defended it. He had prioritized the escorts over the cargo ships. Warships were more valuable than merchant vessels. Losing destroyers to save transports was inefficient. The Navy agreed. No courts-martial, no reprimands. The decision was filed as a reasonable command choice under combat conditions. The merchant sailors had no say. Civilian crews on civilian ships following military orders into military death. The law said the Navy could impress merchant vessels for war service. It said nothing about whether the Navy had to protect them once impressed. PQ-17 became a case study in Admiralty procedures. What it taught was that some deaths were acceptable because the people who died didn't cost as much as the people who gave the orders. The RAF began area bombing of German cities in 1942 under the direction of Air Marshal Arthur Harris. The policy was explicit: not precision strikes on factories, not targeted attacks on military installations, entire residential districts. The goal was to destroy German morale by destroying German homes. The theory came from pre-war studies that predicted civilian populations would break under sustained aerial attack, that workers who lost their families would stop working, that terror from above would collapse the enemy's will to fight. Bomber Command received updated target lists, not war factories, city centers, historic districts, areas with dense housing and narrow streets that would burn efficiently. Lübeck burned in March, Rostock in April, Cologne in May with a 1,000-bomber raid that left 45,000 people homeless. The RAF called it dehousing. The word made it sound like an infrastructure project. We are reducing the enemy's housing stock. We are degrading residential capacity. We are creating a shortage of domiciles. The bombs were high explosive and incendiary, mixed in calculated ratios. High explosive to blow off the roofs, incendiary to light the interiors. The fires would spread from house to house, whole neighborhoods designed to become ovens. Bomber crews were told they were attacking industrial targets. Some believed it. Some knew better and dropped the bombs anyway. By 1943, area bombing was official policy, not a secret program, not a cover for something else. The published strategy of RAF Bomber Command, endorsed by the British War Cabinet and funded by Parliament. Churchill questioned it occasionally in private memos. He worried about the historical judgment, but he never ordered it stopped. The Hague Conventions of 1907 prohibited bombardment of undefended towns. Germany had signed them. So had Britain. But the conventions were written for artillery. No one in 1907 imagined bombers. The law hadn't caught up, and in the gap between old rules and new weapons, entire cities burned while lawyers argued about definitions. After the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that area bombing had not significantly reduced German industrial output or morale. The Germans kept working. They kept fighting. The bombs killed civilians and destroyed homes and accomplished almost nothing except killing civilians and destroying homes. Harris was never prosecuted. He was never censured. He retired with full honors. Britain didn't award him a specific campaign medal, which was as close as the country came to admitting discomfort. But discomfort isn't illegal. Murder is. And if you do it from high enough altitude with the right paperwork, it's called strategic bombing. The Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Japan in April 1941. Both countries agreed to respect each other's territorial integrity and remain neutral if the other went to war. The pact held for 4 years. Japan didn't invade Siberia. The Soviet Union didn't invade Manchuria. Stalin pulled divisions from the Far East and sent them to fight Germany. Japan focused on the Pacific and left the Soviets alone. Then in February 1945, Stalin met Roosevelt and Churchill at Yalta. They asked him to join the war against Japan. Stalin agreed. He demanded territorial concessions. The Kuril Islands, southern Sakhalin, occupation rights in Manchuria. The Allies agreed immediately. The deal was signed. On August 8, 1945, 2 days after Hiroshima and 1 day before Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria with over 1.5 million troops. They invaded Korea. They seized southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Japan's Kwantung Army collapsed. 80,000 Japanese soldiers died in 2 weeks. The Soviets took 594,000 prisoners. Many were shipped to labor camps in Siberia, where tens of thousands died over the next decade. Japan protested that the Soviet declaration of war violated the 1941 Neutrality Pact. The Soviets responded that Japan had violated it first by allowing American planes to use Japanese-occupied territory. This was a lie, but it didn't matter. The real answer was simpler. The pact had a 5-year term. The Soviets waited until they could claim it had expired. Technically, they declared war in the final months before expiration. Even more technically, they declared war after one of the signatories was already collapsing. International law said treaties must be honored. It also said treaties signed under duress were invalid. It also said a nation could withdraw from a treaty if circumstances fundamentally changed. Every rule had an exception. Every exception had a counter-exception. The Soviets drove through the gaps with tank armies. At the Tokyo war crimes trials, Soviet judges sat in judgment of Japanese leaders for crimes against peace, for waging aggressive war, for violating international treaties. The irony was noted by exactly no one in an official capacity. When Allied forces liberated concentration camps in 1945, they found thousands of prisoners who were dying but not yet dead. Typhus was epidemic, dysentery, tuberculosis, starvation. The prisoners were contagious and fragile. Medical supplies were limited. The military commanders faced a decision. They ordered the camps quarantined. Survivors were kept inside the wire, in some cases for weeks. Bergen-Belsen was liberated on April 15th. The British found 60,000 prisoners. 13,000 died after liberation, some from disease they already had, some because they ate the rations the British gave them, and their bodies couldn't process real food after months of starvation, some because they were locked in a quarantine zone with inadequate medical care while the British Army decided what to do with them. At Dachau, American forces photographed the liberation. Then they closed the gates. The prisoners stayed inside. They were fed. They were given medicine. But they weren't free. They were reclassified as displaced persons. The camps became DP camps, different administration, same fence. The military government needed to process them, verify identities, screen for disease, determine nationality, figure out where to send people who no longer had homes. It took months. The legal framework was clear. Liberated prisoners were not automatically granted freedom of movement. They were non-combatants in a military zone under military jurisdiction. The army could detain them for public health reasons, for security reasons, for administrative reasons. The fact that they had just survived German detention was irrelevant to their current detention status. Some prisoners escaped and were hunted down by Allied military police. They were arrested for leaving the DP camps without authorization. Arrested by the people who had liberated them, for the crime of walking away. The situation was explained as necessary, as temporary, as the only practical solution to an impossible logistical problem. And it was all of those things. It was also thousands of people who had been freed from Nazi camps, and then locked in Allied camps, being told once again that their movement required permission. The difference was real. The DP camps had food, medicine, no executions. But the difference was also a fence, and the fence was legal. In 1943, the British government faced a famine in Bengal. Rice crops had failed, cyclones had destroyed infrastructure, Japanese occupation of Burma cut off imports. 3 million people were at risk. The provincial government requested emergency food shipments. The British cabinet reviewed the request. Winston Churchill's administration denied large-scale relief. The reasoning was strategic. Shipping was needed for military operations. Diverting cargo ships to carry rice would delay invasions. Food stockpiles were needed to supply armies preparing for the Burma campaign. Feeding soldiers took priority over feeding civilians. The cabinet also worried that releasing food stocks would lower prices and discourage Indian farmers from growing more rice. Market mechanisms needed to be preserved. Private merchants continued exporting rice from other parts of India during the famine. The colonial government didn't stop them. Exports were good for the economy. The famine killed between 2 and 3 million people. They died of starvation. They died of diseases that spread through malnourished populations. They died in the streets of Calcutta, where bodies were collected each morning like garbage. Churchill's government maintained that the famine was caused by local hoarding and provincial mismanagement, that the colonial authorities in India had failed to distribute available food, that the British government couldn't be held responsible for administrative failures in a subordinate government. After the war, the Famine Inquiry Commission concluded that food was available but not distributed, that prioritizing military needs over civilian needs had contributed to the death toll, that earlier intervention could have saved lives. No one was charged with negligence, no officials were prosecuted. The famine was classified as a natural disaster exacerbated by wartime conditions, not a policy failure, not a decision to let people die, just the unfortunate result of competing priorities during a global conflict. Under British colonial law, the government had wide discretion to allocate resources during wartime. The India Act of 1935 gave the Viceroy emergency powers. Food distribution was a provincial responsibility, but the central government controlled transport and imports. The legal structure was designed so that responsibility diffused upward until it disappeared. Everyone had authority. No one was accountable. 3 million dead, and the paperwork was perfect. The United States interned 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry in 1942. 2/3 were American citizens. They were given a week to sell their homes, their businesses, their possessions. They were allowed to bring what they could carry. Everything else was liquidated at a fraction of its value or simply abandoned. The internment camps were built in deserts, in swamps, in remote areas where the land was cheap because nothing else could survive there. Manzanar in California, Tule Lake, Poston in Arizona, Hart Mountain in Wyoming. Families lived in tar paper barracks with no insulation, communal latrines, armed guards, barbed wire. They were called relocation centers. Not camps, not prisons, centers, as if this were a voluntary program, as if people had relocated themselves to the desert for a pleasant wartime vacation. Executive Order 9066 authorized the military to exclude any persons from designated areas. It didn't say Japanese, it said any persons. The language was neutral, the application was not. No Germans were interned en masse, no Italians, only the Japanese. The order was challenged in court. Fred Korematsu refused to report. He was arrested. His case went to the Supreme Court. In 1944, the court ruled 6-3 that the internment was constitutional. Justice Hugo Black wrote that military necessity justified the exclusion. that the government didn't have time during war to separate loyal citizens from potential saboteurs, that racial discrimination was acceptable when national security was at stake. 3 justices dissented. They said the internment was racism, that it violated due process, that the military had provided no evidence of actual disloyalty. They lost. The internment continued until 1945. People were released after the war ended and told to rebuild their lives. Most had nothing to return to. The government offered minimal compensation, $25 and a train ticket. In 1988, Congress formally apologized and paid reparations, $20,000 per survivor. The apology acknowledged that the internment had been based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. What it didn't say was that it had also been legal, that the Constitution had allowed it, that the Supreme Court had blessed it, that the law had been no protection at all. German prisoners of war held by the Soviet Union were protected by the Geneva Convention. The convention required that prisoners be fed, housed, allowed to send mail, repatriated promptly after hostilities ended. The Soviets signed the convention. They ignored it. Approximately 3 million German soldiers were captured by Soviet forces. They were marched east. They were put in camps. They were put to work. Factories, mines, construction projects, rebuilding the infrastructure their army had destroyed. The death rate in the first year was over 30%. Starvation, disease, exposure, exhaustion. The Soviets didn't have enough food for their own population. Prisoners ate last. Many didn't eat at all. The work was hard labor in sub-zero temperatures. 12-hour shifts, 16-hour shifts. Men dropped and were left where they fell. The Geneva Convention said prisoners should be repatriated quickly after the war. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The Soviets kept the prisoners. They kept them for years. The last German POWs weren't released until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. By then, 1 million hadn't come home, died in captivity, buried in mass graves across the Soviet Union. Families in Germany were told nothing. Men simply disappeared into the east. The Red Cross requested access to the camps. The Soviets refused. The International Committee protested. The Soviets said the prisoners were being treated well, that they were earning their keep, that they would be released when Germany paid reparations for the damage it caused. Germany was in ruins. It couldn't pay. The prisoners stayed. When the Western Allies protested, Stalin pointed out that the Soviets held fewer German prisoners than the number of Soviet citizens who had died in German captivity. 3.3 million Soviet POWs died in German hands, starved, worked to death, executed. The Nazis considered Slavs subhuman. They didn't pretend to follow the Geneva Convention. Stalin asked why the world expected better from him. It was a fair question. Not a legal defense, but fair. The British and American governments seized patents from German companies during the war. Bayer, Siemens, IG Farben, Bosch. Thousands of patents for industrial processes, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, electronics. The seizures were authorized under the Trading with the Enemy Act. German assets in Allied countries were frozen, then liquidated, then transferred. Patents were classified as assets. Bayer's trademark for aspirin was confiscated. The formula became public domain in the United States. American companies manufactured it without paying royalties. The same happened with synthetic rubber, with plastics, with dyes. German chemical companies had led the world in industrial chemistry. Their research took decades. Their patents were the result of billions of marks in investment. The Allies took it all. They called it reparations. After the war, the German companies sued. They argued that patent seizures violated international law, that intellectual property was protected even during wartime, that confiscation without compensation was theft regardless of the nationality of the owner. The courts ruled against them. The judges said that patent rights were subordinate to national security, that enemy property could be seized under the laws of war, that Germany had started the war and therefore forfeited the right to complain about the economic consequences. Some patents were returned in the 1950s as part of post-war normalization. Most weren't. They had already been absorbed into Allied industrial processes, copied, improved, integrated. American pharmaceutical companies were now producing drugs developed in German labs. British factories were using German manufacturing techniques. The knowledge couldn't be unlearned. The legal principle was clear. War suspended property rights, intellectual property, real property, personal property. All of it could be seized. The only question was whether your government was strong enough to keep what it took. Germany wasn't. So it lost not just the war, but the accumulated innovation of its chemical and electrical industries. Legal seizure, legal transfer, legal theft. During the Battle of the Atlantic, both sides killed shipwreck survivors. U-boats sank merchant vessels and surfaced to machine gun the lifeboats. Allied destroyers dropped depth charges on disabled submarines, knowing the crews were still inside. The official justification was that survivors could be rescued by the enemy and returned to service. Every sailor saved was a future combatant. Therefore, killing them was a legitimate military tactic, a preventative measure. The logic was clean. The application was drowning men in oil-slicked water, begging for their lives. In 1942, the British armed merchant ship Laconia was torpedoed by U-156. The ship was carrying Italian POWs. When the submarine surfaced, Commander Werner Hartenstein saw hundreds of men in the water. He began rescue operations. He radioed for help on an open channel. He requested that Allied forces hold fire while he evacuated survivors. He flew Red Cross flags. American bombers spotted the submarine. They attacked. Hartenstein dived. The lifeboats were strafed. The survivors in the water were left to die. Admiral Karl Dönitz issued the Laconia order. U-boats were forbidden from attempting rescue operations. Survivors were to be left in the water. The order was explicit. Do not pick up survivors. Do not take them aboard. Do not tow lifeboats. Do not provide supplies. Rescue attempts endangered the submarine. Therefore, rescue was prohibited. At the Nuremberg trials, Dönitz was charged with war crimes for the Laconia order. The prosecution argued that it was a directive to commit murder. Dönitz's defense pointed out that Allied forces had done the same. Admiral Chester Nimitz submitted an affidavit. He confirmed that American submarines in the Pacific had conducted unrestricted warfare against Japanese shipping, that survivors were not rescued, that the U.S. Navy had issued similar orders. Dönitz was convicted on other charges. The Laconia order charge was quietly dropped, because if leaving survivors to die was a war crime, then both sides were guilty. And if both sides were guilty, then it wasn't a crime. It was procedure. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed more people than either atomic bomb. 334 B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries on residential districts. The planes flew low, dropped their bombs in a pattern designed to create a firestorm. The attack started just after midnight. Within 30 minutes, the fires merged. Superheated air rose rapidly, creating ground-level winds strong enough to pull people into the flames. The fire generated its own weather. The temperature at ground level exceeded 1,000 degrees. Water boiled. Metal melted. People burst into flames before the fire touched them. Civilians ran toward the Sumida River. They jumped in. The water was boiling. They died in the river. They died in the canals. They died in the parks where they thought open ground would protect them. The firestorm burned for 6 hours. 16 square miles of Tokyo were incinerated. Approximately 100,000 people died. Most were women, children, elderly. The men were in the military. The people who burned were the ones who stayed home. General Curtis LeMay planned the raid. He stripped the bombers of their defensive guns to carry more incendiaries. He sent them in at low altitude to improve accuracy. He knew the targets were residential. He knew the casualty estimates. He ordered the attack anyway. After the war, he said if the United States had lost, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He said he was aware of that while he was doing it. The firebombings continued. Tokyo again. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, 66 cities. The Army Air Forces estimated that the incendiary campaign killed between 300,000 and 900,000 Japanese civilians. The number is vague because many bodies were incinerated completely. Families disappeared. Entire neighborhoods became ash. The legal justification was that Japanese cities contained small-scale war industries, home workshops that produced parts for weapons. Therefore, residential districts were legitimate military targets. The bombers weren't targeting civilians. They were targeting dispersed manufacturing infrastructure that happened to be in civilian homes. The distinction was semantic. The bombs didn't distinguish. LeMay received the Distinguished Service Cross. He retired as a 4-star general. In 1968, he ran for vice president on a platform that included bombing North Vietnam into the Stone Age. He lost, but he was never prosecuted, never charged. The fire bombings were classified as conventional strategic attacks, not war crimes, not atrocities, tactics. The Allies agreed at Yalta that prisoners of war would be repatriated to their country of origin. This included Soviet citizens captured in German uniform, Vlasov's army, Ukrainian auxiliaries, Cossacks who fought for Germany. When the war ended, millions of Soviet citizens were in Western hands. Many didn't want to go back. They knew what awaited them. Stalin considered anyone captured by the enemy a traitor. Soviet POWs who survived German camps were often sent to Soviet camps. If they hadn't escaped or died, they must have collaborated. The British and Americans handed them over anyway. Operation Keelhaul, the forced repatriation of Soviet nationals regardless of their wishes. Some went voluntarily. Many resisted. At Judenburg in Austria, British troops used bayonets to force Cossacks onto trains. Families were separated. Children were torn from parents. The Cossacks fought back. The British soldiers beat them. Some Cossacks killed themselves rather than return. They slit their throats, drowned themselves in rivers, hung themselves in the barracks the night before transport. The forced repatriations continued for months. 2 million people. The trains arrived in the Soviet Union. Many passengers were executed immediately. Others went to gulags. The women, the children, the old men who had never worn a uniform. They went too. Guilt was collective. If one family member had fought for Germany, the entire family was suspect. The British and American governments knew. They had intelligence reports. They knew what happened to repatriated Soviet citizens. They handed them over anyway. The Yalta Agreement required it. Breaking the agreement would damage relations with Stalin. The Western Allies needed Soviet cooperation for the occupation of Germany, for the planned United Nations, for the peace that was supposed to come. So 2 million people were sacrificed to preserve diplomatic relations. It was legal. The agreements were signed. The prisoners were technically Soviet citizens. They had no legal right to refuse repatriation. The fact that repatriation meant death was unfortunate, but not illegal. The German city of Dresden was bombed in February 1945. The war was nearly over. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Soviet forces were 100 miles away. Dresden was a cultural center. Baroque architecture, art museums, minimal industry. It was also a transport hub. Rail lines, refugees from the east, German troops retreating through the city. The RAF and USAF conducted 4 raids over 3 days. 772 British bombers on the night of February 13th. 311 American bombers the next day. The British dropped high explosives and incendiaries. The Americans dropped more. Dresden burned. The firestorm was visible for miles. Estimates of the dead range from 25,000 to 40,000. The Nazis claimed 200,000. Exaggerated for propaganda, but the real number was still tens of thousands. Refugees, prisoners of war, civilians. The city center was obliterated. The cultural landmarks burned. The Frauenkirche collapsed. The Zwinger Palace damaged. The Semperoper Opera House destroyed. After the war, critics called Dresden a war crime. Arthur Harris defended the raid. He said Dresden was a legitimate military target, a communications center, a staging point for German reinforcements heading to the Eastern Front. Churchill distanced himself from the decision. He wrote a memo questioning whether the bombing of German cities should continue. Then he withdrew the memo. The Air Ministry drafted a response defending area bombing. Churchill accepted it. At the time of the bombing, the policy was clear: destroy German infrastructure, disrupt transport, break morale. Dresden met all the criteria. That most of the people who died had nothing to do with the war was irrelevant. They lived in Germany. They were enemy nationals. Their deaths were legal. After the war, the city became a symbol. In East Germany, of Western Allied brutality. In West Germany, of the costs of total war. Both narratives avoided the question of whether burning cities full of civilians was something the Allies should have been doing, because answering that question meant confronting the fact that they did it repeatedly, methodically, with legal authorization and military precision. Dresden wasn't an aberration. It was consistency. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted German leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 24 defendants in the main trial. 12 sentenced to death, 3 acquitted, the rest imprisoned. The trials established that individuals could be held responsible for state actions, that following orders was not a defense, that aggressive war was a crime. The precedent was revolutionary, it was also selective. The judges were from the Allied powers: American, British, French, Soviet, no neutral parties. The prosecution was conducted by the victors. The defendants were the vanquished. The charges included waging aggressive war. Germany was guilty. But the Soviet Union had invaded Poland alongside Germany, had invaded Finland, had annexed the Baltic states. No Soviet leaders were charged. The Soviets sat in judgment. The charges included war crimes, mistreatment of prisoners, unlawful killing of civilians. Germany was guilty. But Allied bombing campaigns had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Unrestricted submarine warfare had been conducted by both sides. No Allied commanders were charged. The charges included crimes against humanity, the Holocaust, genocide, extermination. Germany was guilty beyond question, but the trials didn't address colonialism, forced labor in Allied territories, Soviet gulags, the Bengal famine, Japanese-American internment. These were outside the jurisdiction. The court was only concerned with German crimes. The chief American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, addressed this in his opening statement. He acknowledged that the Allies were not perfect, that they had no right to claim moral superiority in all things. But he argued that the Nazi crimes were of a different magnitude, a different nature, that the law had to start somewhere, that imperfect justice was better than no justice. He was right. The trials were necessary. They established principles that shaped international law for decades, but they also established that justice was something victors dispensed to the defeated, that the law applied to some people and not others, that accountability depended on losing the war. At Nuremberg, the criminals hanged. At Yalta, the criminals negotiated. The difference wasn't the crimes, it was the outcome. In 1942, the United States military authorized research into biological weapons. The program was based at Camp Detrick in Maryland, later Fort Detrick. Scientists studied anthrax, botulism, brucellosis, tularemia. The goal was to develop weapons that could incapacitate or kill large numbers of enemy soldiers, and to develop defenses in case the enemy used biological weapons first. The program was classified. The public didn't know. Congress barely knew. The research included open-air testing, releasing bacteria into the environment to study dispersal patterns. Serratia marcescens was sprayed over San Francisco in 1950. The bacteria was thought to be harmless. One person died from an infection. The military didn't disclose the test for decades. During the war, the U.S. never used biological weapons in combat. But the research continued. Production facilities were built. Stockpiles were prepared. The weapons were ready. If the military decided to use them, they were available. The decision not to use them was strategic, not ethical. Biological weapons were unpredictable. They could blow back on your own forces. They could spread beyond the target area. The risk was too high. Not the morality, the risk. Japan used biological weapons extensively in China. Unit 731 conducted experiments on prisoners, vivisection without anesthesia, exposure to pathogens. Frostbite studies, thousands died. The unit released plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, contaminated wells with cholera, dropped anthrax bombs. The death toll is unknown. Estimates range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. After the war, American occupation forces discovered Unit 731. The commanding officer, Shiro Ishii, negotiated immunity. He traded his research data for protection from prosecution. The United States wanted the biological warfare data. Japan had conducted experiments that would be impossible to replicate, unethical to replicate. But the data was valuable, so Ishii and his staff were granted immunity. They were never tried, never punished. They returned to civilian life. Some became doctors. The Tokyo war crimes trials prosecuted Japanese leaders for atrocities in China, massacres, forced labor, sexual slavery. But biological warfare wasn't mentioned. The Unit 731 experiments were classified. The deal with Ishii was secret. The United States didn't want the world to know it had granted immunity to war criminals in exchange for research data, especially research data the U.S. intended to use. The biological weapons program continued through the Cold War. It was discontinued in 1969 when Nixon unilaterally ended offensive biological warfare research. The stockpiles were destroyed. The program shut down. But for 27 years, the United States maintained a biological weapons capability, legal, classified, ready to use. In the Pacific Theater, the taking of prisoners was rare. Japanese soldiers fought to the death. They didn't surrender. When they did, Allied soldiers often killed them anyway. The Pacific War was brutal in ways the European War wasn't. Isolated islands, dense jungles, no front lines. Just killing in every direction until one side was dead. The Marines learned that Japanese soldiers would fake surrender and then detonate grenades. That wounded Japanese soldiers would wait until medics approached and then attack. The response was to stop taking prisoners, to stop approaching wounded enemy soldiers, to shoot anything that moved. Official policy said prisoners should be taken when possible. Field reality said prisoners were a liability. They required guards. They required food. They required transport. And they might be playing dead. Easier to shoot them. Easier to assume every Japanese soldier was a threat until proven otherwise. By death. There are photographs of Marines posing with Japanese skulls. Skulls taken from corpses. Boiled clean. Mounted as trophies. The images were published in American magazines. Life magazine ran a photo of a woman admiring a Japanese skull sent to her by her boyfriend in the Pacific. The photo was controversial, but not because of the skull, because it showed a woman being morbid. After the war, the practice was condemned. But during the war, it was widespread, tolerated, sometimes encouraged. Japanese soldiers mutilated American dead. Americans mutilated Japanese dead. The cycle justified itself. At Nuremberg, mutilating corpses would have been a war crime. In the Pacific, it was morale. The psychological difference was context. In Europe, the Allies fought an enemy they considered civilized. In the Pacific, they fought an enemy they considered subhuman. Racial hatred was policy. Training films depicted Japanese soldiers as vermin. Propaganda posters showed them as monkeys. The dehumanization was intentional. It made killing easier. It made atrocities routine. When the enemy isn't human, the laws of war don't apply. And the Pacific War proved that when both sides believe that, the laws of war become suggestions that no one follows. The Manhattan Project built the atomic bomb in complete secrecy. 130,000 people working on a weapon most of them didn't know existed. Oppenheimer led the scientific team at Los Alamos. Physicists, chemists, engineers. They knew they were building a bomb. They knew it would be powerful. Most didn't know how powerful until they saw it tested. Trinity. July 16, 1945, New Mexico desert. The device detonated with a yield of 22 kilotons, equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT. The flash was visible 200 miles away. The mushroom cloud rose 7.5 miles. Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 3 weeks later, Hiroshima, a uranium bomb. Little boy. 63 kilograms of uranium-235, 15 kilotons. 70,000 people dead immediately, another 70,000 within 5 years from radiation. 3 days later, Nagasaki, a plutonium bomb. Fat Man, 6 kilograms of plutonium, 21 kilotons, 40,000 immediate deaths. Another 40,000 later. The targets were chosen for their military significance. Hiroshima had an army headquarters, a military port, war factories, but it was also a city of 350,000 people. The bomb didn't distinguish between soldiers and children. Nagasaki was a backup target. The primary target, Kokura, was obscured by clouds. The bomber diverted to Nagasaki. The bomb fell on the Urakami Valley, away from the main industrial area, closer to residential neighborhoods. A targeting error. The official justification was that the bombs would end the war, that invading Japan would cost 1 million American lives, that Japanese civilians would fight to the death defending the home islands, that the bombs were merciful, a shock to force surrender. These arguments were made after the fact. At the time, the decision was simpler. The bomb was ready. The war was still going. Use the bomb. The scientists who built it had debated. Some wanted a demonstration. Detonate it over an uninhabited area. Show Japan what would happen if they didn't surrender. Others said a demonstration wouldn't be enough. That Japan would think America only had one bomb. That only actual use would prove the weapon was real and the threat credible. Truman approved the bombing. He didn't agonize. He called it the greatest thing in history. The atomic bombings were never classified as war crimes. They were attacks on military targets using available weapons. That the weapons killed 100,000 civilians was unfortunate, but not illegal. The laws of war didn't prohibit powerful weapons. They prohibited unnecessary suffering, and suffering is necessary if it ends the war. The logic held. The bombs fell. The war ended, and humanity learned that legality is no barrier to annihilation. After Germany surrendered, the Allies divided the country into occupation zones: American, British, French, Soviet. Each zone was governed by military law. The occupying power had absolute authority. German civilians had no legal recourse, no courts, no appeals. Military government. At Potsdam, the Allies agreed on denazification. Every German who had been a Nazi Party member would be investigated, prosecuted if necessary, removed from positions of authority. The policy was ambitious. The Nazi Party had 8 million members. It was impossible to prosecute them all. The Americans created a questionnaire, the Fragebogen, 131 questions about political activity, party membership, military service. Every German adult filled one out. The answers determined classification: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, exonerated. The classifications determined punishment: prison, fines, loss of employment. The process was supposed to be thorough. It was bureaucratic, millions of forms, review panels, appeals. It took years, and it collapsed under its own weight. Too many Nazis, not enough prosecutors. By 1948, the Americans had processed 900,000 cases, less than half. Most received minor penalties, fines they didn't pay. The Americans needed Germans to run Germany. They needed civil servants, police, teachers, engineers, judges. Many had been Nazis because party membership had been required for professional employment. The choice was to keep them or rebuild from nothing. The Americans kept them. The Soviets took a different approach. They arrested Nazis, sent them to camps, used them as forced labor. The camps were the same ones the Nazis had used. Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, new prisoners, same barbed wire. Tens of thousands died in Soviet camps after liberation, died in the same camps where people had died under the Nazis. Different administration, same outcome. The French and British had similar problems: not enough staff to screen every German, not enough political will to pursue comprehensive justice. Denazification became de facto amnesty. By the 1950s, former Nazis held positions in the West German government. the intelligence services, the military, the judiciary. Judges who had sentenced people to death in Nazi courts now sentenced people in democratic courts. Police who had enforced Nazi laws enforced democratic laws. The continuity was jarring, but practical, and legality was the tool that made it work. Nazi laws were annulled, but Nazi officials who enforced them were just following the law of the time. They were guilty of nothing under current law, so they went back to work. The law said their past didn't matter, and the law was followed. The Allies bombed German and Japanese infrastructure throughout the war. Bridges, rail lines, factories, power plants, water treatment facilities. The goal was to cripple the enemy's ability to wage war. The result was that millions of civilians lost access to food, clean water, electricity, medicine. In Germany, the bombers targeted transportation networks, rail yards, bridges over the Rhine, canals. By 1945, moving food within Germany was nearly impossible. Even where food existed, it couldn't reach the cities. Urban populations starved. After the war, conditions worsened. The Allies continued restrictions, no imports, limited food aid. The occupying forces controlled rations. Germans received less food than concentration camp inmates had received under the Nazis. Between 1945 and 1948, hundreds of thousands of Germans died from malnutrition and related diseases. The Allies called it a necessary consequence of defeat. Germany had caused the war. Germans would suffer the aftermath. In Japan, American submarines had destroyed the merchant fleet by 1945. Japan imported most of its food. Without ships, no food arrived. Cities starved. After surrender, occupation authorities controlled food distribution. Japanese civilians received less than subsistence rations. The death toll from malnutrition in the first year of occupation exceeded deaths from the atomic bombs. The policy was deliberate, not genocidal, but punitive. The Allies wanted Germany and Japan weak, incapable of rearmament. Dependent on Allied goodwill, starvation accomplished this. Eventually, the policy changed. The Marshall Plan, Reconstruction Aid. The Cold War made strong allies more useful than weak enemies. But for 3 years after the war, Allied policy toward defeated populations was managed deprivation, controlled starvation. It was legal. Occupying powers controlled resources. They could distribute them as they saw fit. That civilians died was within the bounds of occupation law. After all, the alternative was to feed people whose governments had just tried to conquer the world. And the Allies didn't see why they should. Forced labor was standard practice during World War II. Germany used concentration camp prisoners, slave labor from occupied territories, 12 million people working in German factories and farms. The Soviet Union used prisoners of war, political prisoners, gulag inmates. Forced labor built infrastructure, mined resources, manufactured weapons. Japan used prisoners of war and civilians from occupied territories. The Burma Railway, 100,000 laborers, 16,000 died. The British used colonial subjects, Indian laborers in the Middle East, African laborers in East Africa. Conditions were harsh but not death camps, just coerced labor in a war economy. The United States used Japanese-American internees for agricultural labor, low wages, no choice, voluntary in name only. After the war, Germany paid reparations. Some went to individuals, some went to governments. The payments were inadequate. Decades of litigation. Survivors fought for recognition. But forced labor during the war was not prosecuted as a crime at Nuremberg. Slavery was illegal. Forced labor during wartime was different. The line between them was thin. The Nazis crossed it. But everyone used forced labor, the Allies included. Prosecuting it would have implicated too many governments, so the trials focused on extermination, on the death camps, on genocide. Forced labor was left in a legal gray zone, wrong but not criminal, exploitative but necessary. The post-war world continued using forced labor. Soviet gulags operated until the 50s. Forced labor in colonial territories continued into the 60s. The practice was rebranded: re-education through labor, correctional employment, community service. The terminology changed, the coercion remained, and the legal framework that allowed it during the war continued after. Because if forced labor is a war crime, then building a peacetime economy becomes difficult, and the law adapts to economic necessity faster than it adapts to moral clarity. The war ended in 1945. The armies went home. The prisoners were released. The camps were liberated. The dead were buried. And the legal structures that had enabled 6 years of industrialized killing were quietly filed away. Not abolished. Filed. The laws that allowed area bombing remained on the books. The precedents for internment were never overturned. The treaties that prohibited chemical weapons didn't extend to biological or nuclear. The rules of war were updated. The Geneva Conventions were revised in 1949. More protections for civilians, clearer definitions of combatants, stronger language about treatment of prisoners. But the fundamental principle didn't change. War creates exceptions. Emergency suspends rights. National security justifies violence. The paperwork just needed to be in order. The Nuremberg principles were adopted by the United Nations. Individuals are responsible for war crimes. Following orders is not a defense. Aggressive war is illegal. These were revolutionary ideas, but they applied only to wars that were lost. The next wars used the same tactics. Korea, Vietnam. The firebombing continued. The civilian casualties continued. The legal justifications continued. World War II didn't teach the world that atrocities were wrong. It taught the world that atrocities needed better documentation. That if you write the order down, if you classify it properly, if you cite the right legal authority, then it's not an atrocity, it's policy. The veterans came home and didn't talk about what they'd done, not because it was classified, because it was ordinary, because burning cities and killing prisoners and letting refugees starve were things that happened during the war, things everyone knew about, things everyone agreed were necessary. The law said they were right. The law was written by people who needed them to be right, and 60 million people died while lawyers argued about jurisdiction.